On June 29, 1978, Victoria Berry got stood up. She was supposed to have lunch with the actor Bob Crane, but he never showed. Crane had once been a major celebrity, playing the title role on the sitcom Hogan's Heroes, but by 1978, his heyday was over. He was living in a rented apartment in Scottsdale, Arizona, performing in a dinner theater production called Beginner's Luck. Unfortunately, Bob Crane's luck had run out. When Crane missed their lunch meeting, Berry decided to pay a visit to his apartment. What she saw when she opened the door would haunt her for the rest of her life. Bob Crane was lying on the floor in a pool of blood. He'd been bludgeoned to death, an electrical cord tied around his neck. In the wake of this tragedy, there was an outpouring of grief and support. But in the coming months and years and decades, details of Bob Crane's secret life would emerge. The genial, clean-cut sitcom star had a dark side, and it may just have cost him his life. Bob Crane was born in Connecticut in 1928. From an early age, he was passionate about music, particularly drumming. This led him to drop out of high school and pursue a career in radio. He began working as a disc jockey in 1950 and quickly began making a name for himself on the airwaves. But Crane's first big break came in 1956, when CBS hired him to host their signature morning radio show in Los Angeles. Crane's witty sense of humor, penchant for drumming, and ability to land celebrity guests quickly made him a ratings darling. He interviewed legends like Frank Sinatra, Bob Hope, and Marilyn Monroe. Perhaps rubbing elbows with movie stars gave Bob Crane the acting bug. He began booking small guest spots on TV shows like The Twilight Zone, but he would break into TV in a bigger way when he convinced comedian Carl Reiner to get him a guest spot on The Dick Van Dyke Show in 1962. He made a good enough impression that he was offered a regular role on The Donna Reed Show from 1963 to 1964. In those days, he was still working full-time on the radio and part-time in the studio. But all that would change in 1965. That's when Bob Crane booked the gig that would make him famous and set him on the path to his untimely demise. In 1965, CBS offered Bob Crane the lead role in the sitcom Hogan's Heroes. His witty radio persona and guy-next-door type appearances on TV had impressed executives enough to land him in prime time. Hogan's Heroes was an unlikely comedy in that it was set in a German prisoner of war camp in World War II. The show pitted a group of Allied prisoners running a secret espionage operation against the vain and incompetent Commandant Colonel Klink. Bob Crane played Colonel Robert Hogan, the senior POW in the camp and the mastermind behind the prisoners' sabotage and information-gathering efforts. The show was an instant hit, immediately becoming one of the top 10 most popular programs in its first season. Bob Crane was suddenly catapulted into national stardom, securing Emmy nominations for Best Actor in 1966 and 1967. But Crane's tenure on Hogan's Heroes was also when his personal life began to take a noticeable turn that, in hindsight, was indicative of troubles to come. Crane had married his high school sweetheart 20 years prior to being cast in Hogan's Heroes. During the first season, he'd had an affair with his co-star Cynthia Lynn. When she left the show, he took up with her replacement, Patricia Olson. Crane left his wife in 1970 in order to marry Olson, who was already pregnant with another man's child. The two were wed on the Hogan's Heroes set, with co-star Richard Dawson serving as best man. Dawson would play a critical role in Crane's downfall, but more on that later. Hogan's Heroes was on the air from 1965 until 1971, although ratings-wise, it peaked in its first season. In 1971, the show was unceremoniously canceled by CBS Studios head Fred Silverman. By the final season, the budget had been cut considerably. Executives were eager to move away from campy 1960s comedies that mostly attracted an older, rural audience. Advertisers wanted a younger, more urban viewership. Hogan's Heroes was behind the times, and it got the axe without so much as a proper series finale. The cancellation sent Bob Crane's career into a sharp decline. He made occasional guest appearances and starred in a few movies that flopped. In 1975, he attempted a return to television with The Bob Crane Show, but it was a ratings bust, and the network canceled it after 14 episodes. In general, Crane was unhappy with the roles Hollywood had to offer him following his successful run on Hogan's Heroes. In the early 1960s, he'd been making $150,000 a year as a radio star, a fortune at the time. By the mid-1970s, he was a television one-hit wonder who had to take his show on the road to earn a living. So, he purchased the rights to a play called Beginner's Luck, and began touring dinner theaters as the director/star of the show. It was beginner's luck that brought Bob Crane to Scottsdale, Arizona in June of 1978, to the small apartment where his co-star would find him bludgeoned to death, with an electric cable around his neck. But it wasn't the ups and downs of show business that led to Crane's murder. The likelier cause was his activities off-set, when a different kind of camera was rolling. Many people think his killer was John Carpenter, a strange man who shared an even stranger hobby with Bob Crane. John Carpenter was a charming, uneducated but hard-working electronics salesman. By the time he met Bob Crane, Carpenter had been many things. A musician, a roller derby star, and through it all, always a notorious ladies' man, with an easy manner, dark hair, and piercing eyes. In the early 1960s, Carpenter stumbled into a job with a little-known electronics company that had just set up shop in the United States. It was called Sony. At that time, home video and VCR technology was in its infancy, available only to the rich and famous. John Carpenter's job was to sell this new technology to the Hollywood who's who, install it, and teach them how to use it. In this way, Carpenter was perfectly positioned to make the acquaintance of celebrities. One of his first customers, whom he dealt with personally, was Elvis Presley. Another of Carpenter's clients was Richard Dawson, co-star of Hogan's Heroes and future host of Family Feud. As it so happened, Carpenter and Dawson struck up a friendship. Both were lovers of food, billiards, and pretty girls. But when Dawson introduced John Carpenter to Bob Crane, it quickly became clear that the latter two men had even more in common. As much of a ladies' man as Carpenter was, Bob Crane was in another league. Despite marrying his high school sweetheart and having a family young, Crane had long been a sex addict. Opportunities for extramarital affairs exploded when he became a TV star, one of the most recognizable men in America. No doubt Carpenter was impressed by Crane's ability to use his fame to seduce women. No doubt he immediately saw an opportunity for himself. But Bob Crane saw an opportunity to get something he wanted out of John Carpenter as well. He had his own reasons for taking an interest in the personal film and photograph technology Carpenter was peddling to the Beverly Hills elite. Bob Crane wasn't just a philanderer and a Hollywood horndog. His interests extended to creepy and beyond. Crane liked to document his sexual exploits. Years later, Richard Dawson's son shared an anecdote of his father's. One day, Crane invited Dawson to check out the backseat of his car. Inside, Dawson saw hundreds of photographs of women Crane had slept with, spread across the seats. Some were simple nudes, others were much more explicit. Crane's son, Robert, has denied it strenuously in the years since his father's death, but it's clear that at least some of these women had no idea they were being recorded. Some only found out when they were alerted by police following Crane's murder. On the other hand, some were aware. One woman who consented to being photographed remarked that Crane seemed to enjoy the posing and picture-taking more than the act itself. Suffice to say, Bob Crane enjoyed producing adult films starring himself, with or without the knowledge of the women he slept with. John Carpenter, tech guru to the stars, was the perfect person to help him take this hobby to the next level. He could provide cameras, tapes, and VCRs. Crane could provide women eager to have a fling with a famous actor. And that's how the relationship between the two men became complicated. John Carpenter wasn't just selling Bob Crane video equipment, and he wasn't just a friend either. The two became swinger pals, picking up women together and enjoying their company together. And, naturally, filming it. They would visit bars and nightclubs together where Crane's celebrity status attracted attention from women. Crane typically introduced Carpenter as his manager, which no doubt made the prospect of sleeping with him more enticing. The two continued this partnership for years. When Crane began touring, Carpenter took a job as a national sales manager for Akai Electronics, which allowed him to coordinate work travel to spend time with his friend on the road. In fact, Carpenter had flown into Arizona to spend some time with Crane just a few days before the murder. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking one thing. John Carpenter murdered Bob Crane. There was some kind of falling out or jealousy or unrequited love that exploded into violence. That may be the case, but the circumstances of Bob Crane's death, the questions of who was responsible, it's all even murkier than it seems to this point. When police searched Bob Crane's Scottsdale apartment, they quickly found his vast collection of home movies. That led them straight to John Carpenter, who immediately became suspect number 1. Carpenter's rental car was seized. Inside, police found several blood smears that matched Crane's blood type, a trait shared by only 1 in 7 people. No one with that blood type had been in the car during the time Carpenter had rented it. As far as hard evidence goes, though, that was it. DNA testing wasn't yet available in 1978. Police knew of the relationship between Carpenter and Crane. They suspected, but could never prove, that Crane had been bludgeoned to death with a camera tripod. The entire case was circumstantial, and, in fact, it wasn't a case since prosecutors declined to press charges. That changed in 1994, when police found a startling piece of overlooked evidence in a crime scene photo of Carpenter's rental car. The photo contained what police claimed was a piece of brain matter. Carpenter was arrested and tried for the murder of Bob Crane. At the trial, Crane's son Robert testified that his father had grown sick of John Carpenter by 1978, describing his one-time friend as an obnoxious hanger-on. He further testified that his father had called Carpenter on the night of the murder to end their friendship. But there really wasn't much more to the case than that. The supposed brain tissue in the photo, well, the state couldn't produce it. They'd lost it. DNA tests on the blood from the car were inconclusive. Witnesses testified to seeing Crane and Carpenter out to dinner the night before the crime, having a grand old time. There were also plenty of viable alternative suspects that police never bothered to interview, namely, husbands and boyfriends of the women Crane had seduced. Not to mention Crane's wife, who was days away from finalizing a divorce and inherited his entire estate upon his death. In the end, John Carpenter was acquitted. Robert Crane, Bob's son, went on to publish his father's adult films online, charging $19.95 a month for access on a website that, thankfully, no longer exists. The question of who murdered Bob Crane remains officially an open one, but the story of his secret life stands as a reminder of the dangers of compulsion, exploitation, and the dangerous allure of wealth and fame. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to History Snob for more. Thank you for watching.